Welcome to the latest Seahawks Draft Blog live stream. Today I've been joined by our very special guest, Jeff Simmons from the Real Hawk Talk podcast. Jeff, welcome to the show. There's an awful lot to discuss tonight, as there always seems to be with the Seahawks, but how are you doing?
I'm all right, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Now, let's start off with what I think is the main area to address. You may well disagree with this, but it's pass rush. You know, at the moment, the pass rush in Seattle is a little bit of a concern. No Carlos Dunlap signing yet. Is it inevitable that he's going to sign, do you think? Are they going to play this out like they have done in previous years? Is there a danger that history will repeat and that this will go on for weeks and weeks, and then they'll be left in a bit of a situation like they have been for the last 2 years? What do you think?
So I think it's a couple of things. I think my biggest concern with the front office as a whole has been how they've handled their defensive line in the last 4 years. And if you can look at the Carlos Dunlap thing and say, okay, they read the market right. $14 million was too much. The top tier of the 8 younger guys came off, and now they're left in that range where there's Dunlap and Aldon Smith and Melvin Ingram and some of those other names. And you might say, okay, wow, they played this perfectly. They can get them under value. But to me, it's going to be the 4th year in a row that they don't know who their number one pass rusher is going into a draft. And to me, that's a huge – if you watch the Super Bowl, everyone talked about Tom Brady. And you look at the teams that win the Super Bowl constantly, it's the teams with the great defensive lines. And Shaq Barrett and Jason Pierre-Paul. And then you look at Seattle right now, and I know you've talked about this, Rob. They have L.J. Collier, Darrell Taylor, Alton Robinson, and Rasheem Green. And, yeah, maybe Dunlap comes back at their price and that works all out. But to me, I don't think you can have confidence going into it. I think you should be very worried about their approach here because it could be – even if they sign Dunlap to a 1-year deal, unless Taylor hits, they're going to be going for this exact same song and dance next year.
How has it come to this, Jeff? Because I just think of when Seattle won a Super Bowl and everybody immediately goes to the LOB or Marshawn or Russell Wilson. It's very easy to forget that when they won the Super Bowl, they had a fantastically deep defensive line with 2 superb pass rushers in Cliff Averill and Michael Bennett, well supported by Chris Clemens and Bruce Irvin. Their depth at defensive tackle was very, very good. I mean, this is a team that has lived through what it means to have a great defensive line. And yet, for some reason, for 3 straight years, it has been such a bugbear for them.
It's just an overall big picture of issue of the team right now. They're trying to almost scotch tape their roster every year. And if you look at their team, the 2 most important positions, offensive line, defensive line, and each year it seems like they're doing short-term fixes and they're patching things together. And you look at the offensive line, for example, both tackles are under contract next year. Gabe Jackson's son of an older player. Ethan Posick's a 1-year deal. On the defensive line, it's the same thing where each year they're just trying to patch it together. Like, I understood why they traded Frank Clark. He was out of their price range. DeMarcus Lawrence at the time signed a big deal. But since then, it's been Clowney and then Ziggy Ansah and Dunlap and Mayo and Irvin. But other than Darrell Taylor, who you don't even know if he can play, there's no long-term pieces there. And they're just almost set up for the exact same thing over and over again. And to me, it's the biggest criticism of their roster building. I just see a lot of questions in how they're doing this, and it's why they keep ending up in these situations.
There is always a team that will have they won't be as strong as maybe some others. And I'm sure if we look back at all of the Super Bowl teams over the last 10 years, there will be one that did not have an elite defensive line. Yet it does seem to be a trend amongst the teams that actually do have success, that they at least have a line that can create pressure. Usually if it's a 4-man front with those 4 rushers, or they'll be very creative with their blitzing and be a really good 3-4 team. The Seahawks just don't have any game wreckers, do they? And actually, when you look at the rest of the NFC West, you know, LA has got Aaron Donald and they brought back Leonard Floyd. Floyd benefits a lot from having Donald I think me and you might be able to get a few sacks playing alongside Aaron Donald. So they have options there. San Francisco has got obviously Nick Bosa, but then they have some depth with Arik Armstead and Dee Ford and Javon Kinlaw, who they spent a 1st-round pick on as well. Arizona's got Chandler Jones and now J.J. Watt. Now, J.J. Watt has cost a lot of money. I think I completely agree with what you've said on your podcast that I think that's quite expensive for J.J. Watt given where the D-line market is. But at the same time, if you offered me now L.J. Collier or Rasheem Green or Chandler Jones and J.J. Watt, I don't think there'd be much of a of a conversation there. And I look across the rest of the teams in the NFC West, and I can't help but be really envious, Jeff, as to what the other teams have got there.
Yeah, because if you look, these pieces that J.J. Watt, I couldn't stand his contract, but he's the second rusher on that team, and they're sort of in a win-now window. If you look at Seattle, they just don't have a lot of long-term pieces there. They're hoping that Alton Robinson showed some flashes. I know you brought up some of his stats too, but he's more of a rotational edge rusher. I don't think he's a building block kind of guy. Darrell Taylor's a guy they hope to be that. They traded up for him. They said he was a first-round talent, but he has a rod inserted into his leg. He couldn't play a snap last year. So the reason they're going through this is because they don't really have a long-term piece here. And it was Clowney. They spent the whole offseason last year trying to get Clowney back, which they actually didn't get him back, and that ultimately actually turned into a good decision. But they played it terribly. But they just look, and they're going year after year. Even Dunlap, who I really want them to bring back. You saw what Dunlap did. He unlocked other players on the defensive line. He's 32 years old. We don't know how many years he's going to have left that are good. And if you miss on him, or even if you bring him back, you're still left with the same questions. And whether that's a drafting issue or a roster building issue, instead they spent their allocated money on a safety. And he's their best pass rusher, and he's the only one you figure is going to be around for a while. But they don't have that building block. And to me, again, that's an issue with how they built this roster and why they're in this constant Scotch tape situation.
We've had a question from Justin saying, what do you think the holdup might be with Dunlap? Seems like his market should be well set by now. I guess that the issue might be, Jeff, that we're past the point where you're looking. I don't know if you're like me. You may have more of a life than me, but you're not looking at Twitter going, oh, Adam Schefter's tweeted, what's this? Is it the Seahawks signing somebody? But we've gone past that point now where there's like this stream of this player signed here, this player signed there, and you're waiting for your team to be the team that's listed within the tweet. And we're now at the point where players may well say, look, my market is what it is. I'm probably going to get X now, and I might get X just after the draft. I might wait for a team who misses out on a defensive lineman in the first or second round. They might be willing to offer me a little bit more. There might be an opportunity that's better down the road. I'm not sure whether Dunlap will want to wait like that, but we're kind of getting to that point now, which might make it. But my sort of feeling on it is, and I don't know what you think, is that let's just pick a figure out the air and say that he wants 10 million a year, let's say, or 10 million for 1 year. I don't know. And the Seahawks are saying, well, we only want to give you 7. For me, it's like, well, is it really worth missing out on having at least your best pass rusher from last year for the sake of $3 million when you could turn around to Russell Wilson now and just take his contract and create $17 million? And I don't even think you even have to consult him on that because of the wording within the contract. To me, it would make more sense to actually have Dunlap in the building and at least have that, rather than run the risk of him signing for the Baltimore Ravens and then needing to see what can you get for Melvin Ingram, who's 32, who was injured most of last season? What can you do with Ryan Kerrigan, who's 33? What can you do with Kerry Hyder, who's had 1 year of production? That, to me, is not a position you want to be in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. And I was very critical of the front office for releasing him in the first place. And in the end, it looks like they did play it right. So maybe I was wrong about that. But there's a reason I couldn't be a general manager, because I'm exactly like you. I would never be able to sit around and wait for that, because I see the market exactly how you do. I see all the top guys, the younger guys, the 26, 28-year-olds, they all went off day one. It was one by one, if you remember. It was almost a domino effect. And since then, there's this second tier, and it was all the guys you mentioned. There's Aldon Smith and Melvin Ingram and Jadeveon Clowney and Ryan Kerrigan. But they're all sort of waiting for a domino to drop. They're all sort of that second-tier pass rush group. And the reason I didn't think Dunlap would want to hit free agency is because I thought this would happen. It was sort of a buyer's market after that top tier. So I think he's sitting there waiting for some sort of domino effect. Like if you notice on the weekend, Kyle Fuller signed, and then like 2 minutes later, Xavier Rhodes signed. It's the same kind of thing. I think that group is just waiting for someone to move. But I couldn't agree with you more. Like for me, the risk of not having Dunlap back is massive because he fit in the defense. To me, that's huge. And if you put in a Kerrigan or a Hyder, it's possibly they just whiff. Either they don't fit or they don't work with the players you have. And you've seen that a lot with some of the Seattle players. to me, to have the security that fit, unlocked other players, like what he did for Jaron Reed and what he did for Benson Mayoa, who moved into a proper role. To me, like the length and the size and what he did, to me, that's worth an extra $3 million. I could not agree more with that. I would not be comfortable just sitting there being like, well, there's 7 names out there. I'll just see who falls in my lap. Because you might end up in that situation they were in the first half last year where they just couldn't rush the passer at all. And then the way they play defense, they're not a big blitz team. They're get after with your front four. If you don't have a front four, you have no chance in this defense.
So I thought that the signing of Everett and the trade for Gabe Jackson was a really positive start. I think most Seahawks fans felt that way at free agency because that was 2 needs. And I thought you made a great point in a tweet to Joe Pham, which was essentially this unlocks everything now. You don't have to – I was a little bit – with hindsight, I thought it was a great point because if they hadn't have got Gabe Jackson, that could end up being your sort of clowny thing from this year, that you spend the rest of the offseason sort of chasing that position, hoping that something's going to emerge there, and maybe it never does. And then that becomes a bit of an issue, and it dictates what you do in draft and stuff like that. So to get that done, because Pete did say at the end of the season, left guard is a priority position for us. We need to sort that. And one way, whether Jackson starts there or Lewis, they've got a left guard now and a right guard that they can believe in. But I felt it was a start. And I thought that has to be the platform for other moves. Because if you look at just to take the Super Bowl champion, because you often sort of look at who's just won. And I guess you could lump the Chiefs in when they won the year before, and maybe even the Niners when they're in the Super Bowl. They have pass rushers, and look, the Chiefs have Clark and Jones, but they have Clark and Jones. The Niners have great pass rush. The Bucs have had a great defensive line. Weapons galore for the Chiefs and the Bucs, just all over the field. Depth at running back, or a running game with the Niners that doesn't rely on necessarily having an elite back. It's if they've got their guys that they can fit in. On defense, apart from the pass rush, you've got fast linebackers. We've seen that with the Bucs and the Niners, maybe not so much with the Chiefs, but those two teams have it. And you sort of go through everything and you see, okay, this is kind of the framework you need to be a Super Bowl team. And I look at the Seahawks right now, they don't have the pass rush. They have 2 really good weapons and maybe a third in Everett, but that really is kind of where they're at. They rely on like having one back who's really good, and he's had health issues over the years in Chris Carson. They don't quite have as much in the second level that they used to have. And while Bobby Wagner will always give you a certain level of play, I don't think he's that lightning quick, fly around the field, hammer people type of linebacker that maybe he was a few years ago, which is understandable because he's getting up in age. Maybe Jordan Brooks can supply a bit more of that on a consistent basis moving forward. I just don't quite see the pieces there. And what I wanted to see from free agency was like a bit more aggression. I know that they're up against the cap, and I would have thought they would have created some by now to make some more moves. But when you only have 4 draft picks and now 3, this is really the only chance you have to get better. You've made your bed to an extent with the draft. So while other teams, like I'm looking at the Steelers, they need a cornerback and they probably need a running back and maybe some O-line help. They have their first 3 picks in the draft. They could trade down and get more picks. There's a chance that they can fill some of those needs in the draft. Seattle doesn't have that luxury. They've kind of got to get to work now. And if Dunlap goes, and I think Ingram's talking to the Chiefs, and then you're relying on a Kerrigan I don't think Clowney will come back after what happened last year. I just think maybe there's bridges burned there. I don't know. I get that. That's my hunch on that because it was such a saga last year. And then you look at the other positions, Jeff, and there's no third receiver. There's no real. Look, they've got some depth behind Carson. I don't think it's particularly that spectacular. Cornerback still might be a question mark. Hopefully, Witherspoon solves that, but I'd still like to see one more. None of this seems to be forthcoming, though.
No, and if you listen to me on my show, the one thing I personally talk about a ton is depth. And I think that the teams that win consistently and the teams that flame out in the first couple of rounds, like Seattle's been, are the difference where they have roster depth because there's injuries. You need guys to step in and play. And you mentioned it. The first part of free agency, because of their draft situation, they needed to make some moves. And you know what? If you look at all their moves in isolation, they're all pretty good moves. I didn't love Ethan Posick, but I think you made the point that he's probably more of a hedge than anything else, but all the other moves were pretty good. But again, you have to unlock the second part of this free agency. That's the whole point of this. And you mentioned it, the defensive line is a huge area of need on this team. You can't go in thinking like, okay, we have Alton Robinson, Darrell Taylor, Collier, and Green, and we're going to be fine. Like that just won't work. So you need to attack this spot. And I think Dunlap just makes so much sense. And then you look at across the team, the receiver. If Lockett or Metcalf gets hurt right now, and none of them, Metcalf hasn't gone hurt, and he had injury issues in college. Freddie Swain is now a starting receiver for you. And they lost. I wasn't a big David Moore fan. They lost him. Jacob Holster was replaced. But you look across their roster, even like if Dwayne Brown gets hurt, and usually, okay, they're like, okay, we have the draft. But they don't have the draft. So they need – this is a unique situation where you saw them add a void year to Chris Carson's contract, which went against some of their past philosophies. They're going to have to, if they want to compete for a Super Bowl, go against how they don't like pushing money into the future because they don't have the draft capital. I don't see how they're going to get picks through trade. Like, you're not going to trade Lockett away and then create a hole because you sort of missed the receiver boat. You're not going to trade Jaron. You could trade Jaron Reed. He's the only one I see as an option. But really, they're going to have to get really creative. And I think it's like you. They have to use this second phase of free agency to start picking names out because you've mentioned all the ways they can create space. It's sitting right there. Whether that's a trade of some of the established players or that's pushing money into the future because they need defensive line. They need a third linebacker. They need a third receiver. They don't even have a third receiver on their roster. There's no way Freddie Swain can be counted on for that. And they don't have a backup quarterback. They don't have a third tackle. There's a lot of questions. So yeah, to me, this phase of free agency will determine. Like I liked what they did. I said it unlocked this port, but if they miss on this point, their team is left with a huge hole because you're a draft guy. Like you know how important the draft is. The draft is my favorite part of the football season. So the fact that the Seahawks are going with 3 picks right now and only one of them in the first 2 days, it's not like you can expect to add players, especially this is a weird year enough to begin with.
Yeah, I just don't really understand, Jeff, where the players are going to come from. I mean, it's one thing to have like a couple of existing needs and be saying, okay, there's just a couple of things to do now and then they're done and that's it. And the Seahawks have a lot of things to do. I mean, as you say, it's starting positions and depth. And you have, I was going to say, I'm going to try and see what the over the cap is saying for the exact cap space that the Seahawks have right now. I've got the list up here to see. Okay, the Seahawks currently have minus $1.5 million according to over the cap. So they're over the cap. And they've still got a lot of work to do. And it's not like they could just cut somebody or trade somebody and go, right, okay, we've got 10 picks. Here we go. We'll get a backup quarterback there. Or, it's not as if they can say Alex Magoo's the backup quarterback because he just punched someone in a bar. So, there's a lot to get done. And I kind of sit here and I go, okay, what are they going to do? Because I just don't see the answer because people will go, well, maybe they'll trade Tyler Lockett. And then I think, well, good luck selling that to Russell Wilson, who's not exactly, in lockstep with the team right now. If you say, well, we're going to trade Tyler Lockett, Freddie Swain, your number 2, or rookie, then I can't imagine that will go down too well. You could trade Jaron Reed and that, maybe that would make some sense, but I think that's about 10 million you save. And you probably still need more than that if you're $1.5 million over the cap already. And he's probably not going to get you a draft pick, which is, I think, at absolute best. You might be looking at the 4th round or something like that. If Rodney Hudson's around 3, I know Jaron Reed's a couple of years younger, but I don't think there's going to be a massive demand for a defensive tackle like him, especially on his contract with 1 year to go. So I can't imagine there's going to be a huge demand there. The options that I've kind of talked about, not because I'm absolutely desperate to get rid of Bobby Wagner or Jamal Adams, it's simply because it's one of the 2 of the only ways that they can, one, create some sizable cap space now and in the future. And they're 2 players who, could you get a late second or a third for Bobby, potentially for a team that needs identity and culture, and especially I always think someone like Robert Saleh, who's just trying to initiate a new defense, could really do with somebody who knows the defense better than even he does. So that could be a fit. And then with Jamal Adams, he's I don't know what you would get for Jamal it's not going to be 2 firsts, a third, and a player, but you may get exactly face. Well, that is it, isn't it? But you may get 2 2s. I don't know, a 1 and a 3, like they did with Frank. If there's a team that thinks they need a blitzing box safety, I don't know. I mean, they're the options. I mean, the other one is that, and I brought it up earlier. They could just restructure. They could have restructured Russell Wilson's contract at any point, and there can only be one reason why they haven't done that. And that's because they think within the next 12 months, he might move on and they want to leave that door open. Otherwise, they would have just done what the Chiefs did with Mahomes.
Yeah, to me, that's the big lever to follow in the next couple days, weeks, because you mentioned it. They're over the cap. And I did think the reason a lot of us were looking to see they were going to do it before free agency, because if you looked at their situation, even after cutting Dunlap, they had so many needs. And really, they not a lot of space. And I know you've been mentioning the Adams and Wagner thing, and I don't think it's crazy because obviously I like both of them a lot as players, but the Seahawks are in a position where they're unbalanced based on where they're allocating their resources to. And like some people call the Seahawks cheap, but they're paying Bobby Wagner $18 million a year to be a middle linebacker. And Bobby's great. And I love Bobby as a player, but that's just not a good allocation of money at this point. I think the CJ Mosley deal screwed them up a couple of years ago and painted them in a corner. And yeah, if you can get a good draft pick for him, I don't know what you can get for his contract. He's got a year left beyond this. But if you can get a reasonable rate, maybe you bring back KJ Wright for cheaper, move Brooks to the middle, and you can use the savings elsewhere. That's a creative idea. I don't know if the Seahawks will do it because of all the issues surrounding them. But to add to the problem is that Russell Wilson, all the issues going on with him and the team, it's sort of a win now type of season. It's sort of created this, you got to win now with this team, and there's just a lot of moves left to be done. And I do agree with you that the reason they probably didn't do it is because I think they were thinking about trading him. And if there were different teams on his trade list, it might have happened. But Chicago just always seemed like a weird fit to me. And the end result was exactly the same thing I was saying the whole offseason. There wasn't a match. Like they could have come up with the best possible offer, which is what they thought they did. There just was no match. But to me, until Seattle either does something with Bobby or Russell's contract or makes a pretty big trade, they're going to be left with a really iffy roster. So they're going to have to do something like that in the coming days because they're out of cap room right now. And they need defensive line. They need a third receiver. They might need another cornerback. They need a third tackle. They need a backup quarterback. And they have 3 draft picks and we've mentioned this enough. So I think you're right on the money.
I think Danny O'Neill made a good point earlier today on the radio that he was suggesting that what the Seahawks need to do is sit down with Russell Wilson right now and say, listen, we are not trading you next year. Okay. We're going to sort this now so that either you're here long-term or whatever, we're moving on, but you've got to open up your list of teams so we can get a fair deal. And ultimately buy that because they want to restructure his contract to open everything up. And actually, what I think would be best is I've always felt this is the best thing to do is just to go to Russell Wilson and say, let's make this right. And then you make it right and then you restructure his deal or you even give him an extension and put a bow on everything so that it says to the world, we will not be having this conversation in 12 months. Because I think that has to be avoided at all costs. I think if you wait, and this doesn't get resolved, and I do fear, Jeff, a little bit that seems to be the road that they're going down, that it'll just be a topic that it's like after every game. Let's say there's a game where Russell throws 40 times and they win handsomely. Everyone afterwards is going to be, and do you think they nearly traded this guy away? And, and that's the whole narrative is going to be. And then if Pete runs the ball a few extra times one week and they lose, then it's going to be, they should let Russell Wilson cook. Is he going to ask for a trade in the offseason? This is why he kicked up the fuss that he did. And then when you go into the playoffs, assume they get to the playoffs. They have usually under Russell Wilson. They're in the playoffs. The Seahawks better win this game. Otherwise, Russell Wilson's going to ask for a trade. I don't think that is a great place to be, rather than you sorted this out in March and then nobody talks about this again, ever. But the alternative to not sorting it out, if you have that conversation, you sit down with him and he says, no, I'm not happy, I don't want to do all this stuff or whatever, or your vision doesn't match with mine, I actually genuinely want to go. And by the way, I'm not adding to my list of teams, which that is what has been reported, that he's not going to do that. Mm-hmm. He's not going to be open to Carolina, New York, Miami, Philadelphia in the top 10. And look, some of those teams might be more interested given what's happening with Deshaun Watson right now, but he's not going to be willing to go down that path. Then you kind of, I don't think you've got any choice but to sort things out with Russell Wilson. Yeah, I would have thought they'd have sorted it out 3 weeks ago. And we're here deep into free agency. And I'm still wondering why this slow dance of, you know what? I had a girlfriend when I was 13 years old.
Yeah.
And she was in the year above me at school. So I was very nervous because that was a big deal back then. That's like going out with a supermodel, like a girl in the year above. And we didn't talk. We were going out, but we didn't talk for 7 weeks. I would play soccer, football over here. She would watch with her friends over 7 weeks. We didn't talk to each other. When we finally talked to each other, we got on like a house fire, went out for a year. Okay. I feel like Pete and Russell are in that same thing right now. And they just need to just go and talk to each other and get this sorted and get on with it, because I don't think it's doing anybody any favors.
No, I don't understand their approach, the Seahawks approach here. I think their overall view of this and their PR has been very odd, because before free agency, almost every team did availability with either their coach or their general manager. The Seahawks stayed quiet, not only through the media, but they could have done an availability and just shot this down pretty quick or leaked something. But they just let everything stew. And I saw a lot of beat writers were like, well, that's just how they operate. This is a little bit different. Like, you sort of have to operate differently when it comes to Russell Wilson leaking teams in a trade. Right before I came on with you, like, I saw Mike Silver. I don't know if you saw his hit.
Yeah, I saw it, yeah.
That he came out and said, like, okay, they seem to be okay for now. It's like, okay, they're okay for this year. And you saw Russell was kind of pushing Chris Carson. He liked some tweet about Gabe Jackson. He said go Hawks the other day, something like that. But even in Mike Silver's report, he still said, okay, for next year, we don't know. And so this whole song and dance is set up, as you said. There's going to be games where Pete's going to run the ball. They're going to play the Rams. It's going to be a close game. And the questions are just going to come. Mike Florio, Colin Cowherd, those guys are going to have a field day with this story. And they should, because really they set up this is what PR is. This is PR 101, controlling the message, controlling the story. And they let this thing spiral. And they could have come out, as you said. And now it's getting to the point where the more it got caught up in media, the sides probably split further and further apart. And they're going to have to come back together. People will probably come back with everything's okay. Russell's my guy. I've loved Russell the whole time. But this is why so many people have ended poorly with Pete, because he puts on that face and then he cuts you. And
yeah, and he's done it so many, and we've seen it. There's been bad blood with a few guys. I don't think the relationship breaks, but they go away in the way that you wouldn't necessarily want them to part.
Yeah, because Pete's one of these guys who he truly sees the best in everything. But then you have to trade Michael Bennett away to set your culture back. And then you're like, well, why were you like my best friend these all years? And then you're trading me because I'm a problem. So Pete, this is a thing for Pete. And I think Pete needs to just get real, because I can see John Schneider being pissed off at this kind of stuff. He's more of like a low-key, drama-free kind of guy. But Pete's one of these guys that he brings this kind of culture on, and then this thing just spiraled out of control, and they could have ended it, and it's going to keep going until there's, as much as Russell seems to be supporting the Gabe Jackson acquisition, the Chris Carson move, anytime he has a bad game, or if they take the ball out of his hands, or the team isn't good enough around him, say the offensive line has a game where they allow 6 sacks, what do you think everyone's going to talk about?
Imagine the first press conference from both. And if someone's got any sense, they will say to Russell, how would you like to play this season? And he will go, up-tempo. I want to set records. I want to throw it around. We're going to be aggressive, attack teams. And then they should ask the exact same question to Pete Carroll, because he will then go, well, we just want to keep it close. And, I'm happy with the 17-14. I know you guys don't like that kind of a game, but I personally enjoy that kind of. And from there, the scene will be set for the rest of the year, which is just two opposites, repelling each other all the time. We've kind of come on to Russell Wilson, and I want to sort of just quickly play this video address it, and then we can move on to a couple of the more interesting topics, because I feel like the Russell Wilson thing, it gives everybody a migraine. So I'm going to just play this video. I'll give you a thought afterwards, Jeff, and I want to know what your thoughts are on this. This is something that Adam Schefter mentioned on Friday, which kind of set this off again.
This is contingent upon the Seahawks doing all the work they can and all the diligence they can on the quarterbacks in this draft, and knowing that they can secure the quarterback that they fall in love with. And if that happens, Russell Wilson's going to be traded. If it doesn't happen, they'll hold on to him. They'll do what's best for the team. But if there's a quarterback out there that John Schneider and Pete Carroll feel strongly about, this trade's in motion.
Do not sleep on Seattle trading Russell Wilson is the message. Moving on now to our next topic.
So there we go. That's what Adam Schefter said on Friday. That was the third day in a row, by the way, that Adam Schefter was on ESPN talking about this particular topic, which is unusual. You know, they don't usually have Schefter repeat himself kind of 3 days in a row, but that is what they did here. And every day it seemed to sort of show a bit more leg until that, that was the sort of the conclusion there. I've got a couple of thoughts on this, Jeff. There are two reasons why I am paying attention to this and not completely dismissing it. Firstly, I mean, if the Seahawks were we've talked about it already, if the Seahawks weren't definitely 100% not trading Russell Wilson, then they'd just do his contract now, free up $17 million, and it'd be done. And they could just come out with a tweet right now and say, Russ is our quarterback, in the same way that Green Bay did with Aaron Rodgers at the end of last season. This could be nipped in the bud right now, and they haven't done that, which, if nothing else, says to me they're keeping their options open. It doesn't mean that I think he's going to be dealt. I just think that they're keeping their options open. The other thing is, Schefter doesn't get everything right. I don't have a list of things where he's got stuff wrong, but he's not a BSer generally. I mean, like he doesn't tend to delve into the coward Florio. I've got to do an hour-long segment, not an hour-long segment. I've got to do a 15-minute segment every day on 8 topics, and Russell Wilson's manna from heaven, because I can just talk about whatever. I can get a guest on. I can ask Chris Sims about it. It's easy talking points for a show that is on every day and would be pretty repetitive if they didn't just find interesting things to talk about. Schefter's a journalist. He's not a presenter. He's not a talking head. He's not a Skip or a Stephen A. He's a journalist. And for him to sort of talk in those terms, I don't think Russell Wilson's going to be traded, because I don't think they're going to find anybody in this draft who says, they say, yes, we desperately want them. Because I've watched all of the quarterbacks in this draft anticipating a trade, and the two that are really are going to go 1 and 2, Trey Lance could go anywhere from 4 to 34. Justin Fields could go from 4 to 34. There's issues with both of them that would make me think, I can't see the Seahawks going, that's the guy that we're getting rid of Russell Wilson for. Mac Jones, just don't see it. I really like Kellen Mond. Again, though, is Kellen Mond a player you go, we're going to trade a top 5 franchise quarterback for Kellen Mond? I don't know about that. Sam Darnold's name gets thrown around a lot. Mike Tannenbaum mentioned it again on ESPN today. He completely changed his tune from last week, saying it's not happening a trade. So today it is happening, and Sam Darnold, he's joined the Sam Darnold crew. Brad Biggs has reported about that. The New York Daily Times did. Coward mentioned Darnold. But the problem with that, Jeff, is that then the Jets have to be involved in some way. It's easier said than done to just get the Jets involved. I mean, what are you doing then? Giving the Jets a second-round pick from Seattle or Chicago? Are the Bears just not going to have any picks for the next 4 years? I mean, eventually there has to be a point where you go, it just seems like there's too much to be done here for a trade to happen. And yet, because it's Schefter, I can't completely 100% go, no, it's definitely not happening, even though I don't think it's likely now. So what do you think?
I think that's a reasonable approach. And yeah, what you said is very smart. And I used to work in the media myself. You have to understand there is a huge difference between what Adam Schefter does and what Mike Florio does. And Mike Florio put out a tweet a couple of weeks ago, like right after Ben Roethlisberger signed his new contract. And he said, I don't understand why people in the media celebrate when a juicy storyline comes to an end. If you want a perfect insight into what Mike Florio is, it was that tweet. He wants to get every juice, and he does 2 shows every day. He's got that website going. He needs to fill a lot of content. So I understand where he's coming from. Schefter is an information broker, and probably he's different than Ian Rappaport because he doesn't work for the league. So Schefter talks to agents and he talks to teams almost all day. That's how those guys work. I've worked with those guys in other sports, not Schefter specifically, but Schefter, when Schefter speaks, I always say the first thing to ask yourself is who wants this out there? Because Schefter's not sitting around digging for news stories like maybe like a columnist is or someone like Jay Glazer might be. Schefter's getting things out. He's using it to get other information. He's exchanging information with teams and agents. So to me, it means one of 2 things. It means either Mark Rogers wants this out there and wants teams to think he's still available, or 2, Schneider is basically saying, you have to come get me with a much better offer to beat that deal. So I think it's either side keeping the option open. And I think when Schefter says it, you have to look at it a little differently than someone else because Schefter's talking to teams and agents all day. So I think if, say, the Jets were involved and say the Seahawks targeted one of those 4 quarterbacks at the top, I think that could have worked. But from my understanding, Russell does not want to play in New York. I think that team is just too far behind. I think it's way too big of a risk for what he wants to be a legacy guy.
And culture.
Yeah, the culture. It's just, I don't think it's a fit for Russell. And during the whole Bears thing, I was the one who was kind of saying this is bullshit, to a better word, because there was no match. And the Darnold thing kept coming out from the media. And I said, what, you're going to get 3 low picks from the Bears and have to give away one of your picks to get Darnold? It was just, then you're left with what? I'm not a big Sam Darnold guy, but I could see Pete being one. Pete kind of had a type at USC, and Darnold is that big, accurate sort of guy that Pete loved. But again, I think it's one of those things where it's still on the table if someone gave them the offer that fit, get into the top 10. But who's that team? How does that work? And you have to get Russell on board. If you just, as you said before, if you keep looking at it, there's just too many things to fit into one puzzle where it's hard to see it actually happening. But I think if somebody made the right offer to them where they felt they could get their guy, I think they would do it. Yeah, I think that's what Schefter's saying. Very interesting.
I mean, on Darnold, I watched 6 games of Sam Darnold, 2 all 22, which I never do. I never watch NFL all 22 because I haven't got the time. And I watched just to watch Darnold. I watched him against the Seahawks, and I watched 4 games from 2019 when they went on that winning run. I think they finished 6-2, just to see him playing in a non-terrible Jets team. And my only sort of lasting thought was, I don't think it could ever be a top 10 quarterback, but I can see why coaches and GMs would value him. Now, obviously, they don't value him as much as Carson Wentz and Matt Stafford because they've both been traded and he hasn't. But at the same time, I can see why I could see a GM or a coach talking himself into Sam Darnold because he's no drama, throws well on the run, big arm, good old boy type that you could trot out there to run your offense for you. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. That's the end of Russ talk. So now let's move on. The one thing I wanted to ask you about was it was draft strategy, because I think that you've got some very interesting things to say about this. And when I've sort of listened to you on your podcast, I think you have some good ideas on the way that teams approach things. And I've had a real issue with the way that the Seahawks have approached things over the last 2 or 3 years. I want to come on to 2019 in a second, but I want to start with last year. I don't really understand why the Seahawks didn't plan ahead a bit more. I mean, if you're going to keep Bobby Wagner, if you thought we might trade Bobby Wagner in 2021, then Jordan Brooks somewhat makes sense because you're saying we're going to make a saving, we're going to get a draft pick, and Jordan Brooks has had a year in the defense to take over as the middle linebacker. If your plan is to keep Bobby Wagner, try and re-sign KJ Wright, and have Jordan Brooks, a first-round pick on a linebacker makes no sense. When you could have, you moved up for Darrell Taylor. Why didn't you move up 2 spots for Cesar Ruiz and have your center in place for the next 4 or 5 years at a great value? Why are we having to talk about center now? Why didn't you tap into an amazing receiver class and get a 3rd receiver so that Russell Wilson doesn't need Antonio Brown and doesn't need to go down that dark alley? And you've got a great receiver who's also, like DK Metcalf, still got a few years of great club control. Why didn't you think, hey, Shaq Griffin's out of contract soon. We'll draft a cornerback maybe a little earlier. Take someone like Trevon Diggs, who was on the board when you trade up for Darrell Taylor. There didn't seem to be any sort of anticipation of the holes that are emerging in the future. It seemed to be that they just decided, do you know, we quite fancy a linebacker. Yeah, do you fancy a linebacker, John? Yeah, I fancy a linebacker. Let's just take a linebacker. And then it seemed to be, crap, we haven't done anything on the pass rush. But Darrell Taylor kind of looks like the guy that we would take. So I know that he's really injured and that there are people. Tony Pauline was doing a podcast every week saying, and a couple of times he said, there are some teams in the league that don't have him on their draft board because they can't do the testing that they want to really get into that injury to find out if he can play this year or even beyond. And the Seahawks took that information and decided, we're trading a third-round pick to move up and draft him. So I have a real issue with how they took 3 picks in the first 2 rounds, Jeff, which should have been a golden opportunity, and turned it into this.
This is by far my biggest issue with this regime. And we talked about before the Scotch taping their roster and why they're in the. If you want to look at why they're in the mess they are now, and it's not a mess. They have a roster of like a playoff team, but that's sort of what they are, the playoff team that's plateaued. But if you want to look at why they are, and I just saw someone mention that Pete's the problem. This is my issue with John Schneider. I don't see a vision in how they're building a team. And what you just said is something I've brought up so many times, and I'm glad to hear you say that, because you look at last year's draft. It's a perfect example of sort of the issues I have with where they are. And like that was a historic wide receiver class. They have Tyler Lockett coming up in the last year of his deal. DK Metcalf, you knew he's going to have an extension coming up soon. So you can sort of ease that transition. It gives you leverage. Say you want to trade Tyler Lockett, knowing that you're going to have some issues with your roster next year, you bump up the receiver. There you go. Or you don't really have a third receiver, and you're going to have to rely on Josh Gordon, or maybe they were high on Philip Dorsett, and that messed up their thinking. But it seems like they're doing these things in 1-year windows, and the Brooks thing is perfect because KJ Wright got hurt last year. He was supposed to have surgery. And I think the team overreacted to that surgery. They didn't think Wright would be ready for the season. But then why did you trade up for Cody Barton the year before? So you're left with all these odd questions of, it seems like they're just doing everything in 1-year windows. And you look at the Jamal Adams trade. It's a perfect another one. You knew you had all these holes coming up. You knew you had a limited cap situation. And they traded him in the pandemic. It's not like they didn't know the cap might go down. Did they not model what was going to happen in this offseason where you're going to be left with no picks and all these roster holes and this limited cap? So it comes back to their drafting. And so many people are like, well, they're cheap and they don't spend on the offensive line. But I was looking at it the other day, like the best offensive lines in the league. They're almost New Orleans, all drafted. Ruiz, McCoy, Ramchick, Armstead, all of them. Green Bay, they drafted Elgin Jenkins after Seattle took LJ Collier a couple picks later. Tampa Bay, Wirfs. And it's not just the high picks. They got their left tackle, Donovan Smith, Alex Kappa, the right guard, Marpet, was a late second rounder. All these lines that are the best lines in the league are coming from the draft. And you look at the Seahawks who don't have sustainable roster building, it's because they're doing these 1-year patch things and they're overreacting. The problem with my John Schneider, and I think he's a big part of this issue, is he seems to go into drafts with the wrong approach. He seems to hyper-focus on positional needs instead of sustainable team building. And they went into that defensive end draft after trading Frank Clark, and they said, we need a defensive end. And all the defensive ends came off the board. Instead of saying, okay, maybe we pivot here, they drafted LJ Collier, who, even if you think LJ Collier is an improving player, which he showed some signs of, there's no way that was a good first-round pick. The Rashad Penny thing. They spent a first-round pick on a backup running back. Like, that's as bad of a use of a first-round pick as you can do. But the 2020 draft with Brooks, it's like, you look at their team, and look at their team now. They have both their tackles are not signed for beyond this year. Both their safeties are not signed beyond this year. Both their defensive tackles are not signed behind this year. And now you have 3 picks. So it seems like there's almost no long-term plan. It just seems like they're scotch taping and they're constantly trying to solve these short-term issues. When you look at that Brooks pick, it's a perfect example. Darrell Taylor, like, okay, we didn't sign Clement. We got to get a pass rush. They should be thinking, okay, how do we build this roster? When they first got here, they really had a good plan. Like, I did a story back in 2013. I talked to Todd Lewicki, who hired these guys. And he said both of them came in thinking, we want to be that Pittsburgh-Baltimore team. And you look at the rosters they had early on. There was a clear plan in terms of the kind of players, their early picks were all offensive linemen. They spent a lot of money on defensive line. And now you look at their team, and you almost have no idea what they're trying to build. It's just like a missed plan. One year they're trading Frank Clark. The next year they're acquiring picks. And the next year they're trading for Clowney. They're trading for Dunlap. Like their ideals are kind of counteracting each other. They're counterintuitive. And I'm just constantly left scratching my head of what they're trying to accomplish. And it all comes back to the draft because that's how you build a team in this league. Everyone talks about Tom Brady in Tampa Bay, and obviously he was important. But you look at their draft last year, they got Tristan Wirfs, Antoine Winfield. The year before, they drafted that basically entire secondary. And that's how they're able to keep signing these guys because they have contributors on the cheap. And you look at Seattle, they've had pretty much one hit in the last 5 years. And that's why they're here today. And I agree. They need to start planning this roster because if you look at what's coming next year, everyone will say, whoa, they got like $130 million of cap room. And I know you've mentioned this before. Look at
about 19 players signed.
Yeah, they got to sign basically an entire team. 2 safeties, 2 tackles, 2 defensive tackles, an edge rusher. Chris Carson could be up again. DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. Who are they left with? You don't know if Russell's coming back. So, yeah, they're drafting. To me, that's the biggest issue with their team. That 2017 draft was just such a disaster. And it's frustrating because I'm like you. Like, I see what they're trying to accomplish with these short-term needs, but then you can't see a plan.
Yeah, they've got 22 players signed for next year with $77 million to spend. And if they re-sign Jamal Adams, let's say for $18 million, then that takes that down to about $60 million to sign basically 30 players, which is without a first-round pick again. So there's no direction. Everything that you've said is completely right. I want to just address this one before I ask you about the 2019 draft. Ethan says Bucs just won the Super Bowl with 2 really good linebackers. The Bucs won the Super Bowl because they had a complete roster. That's why they won, not because they had 2 really good linebackers. The 2019 draft, you touched on it, and I think this is a great point. And I want to also talk a little bit about Jamal Adams. But in 2019, it really felt like they'd convinced themselves. So it's a great defensive line draft. It was what everybody in the media was saying. You could see a long list of defensive linemen. But it also wasn't a huge shock that Rashawn Gary and Brian Burns and people like that came off the board when they did. Burns came off in the range where everybody expected him to go. Rashawn Gary, there was a feeling he might fall to the 20s just because of a shoulder injury. But even then you kind of think, well, should you be taking somebody who's going to drop from 10 to 25 because he's got a shoulder injury? When those players went, they should have pivoted. They should have had at least a scenario in their mind where it's, okay, this guy goes. This is what we're left with. At that point, we draft a wide receiver. At that point, we draft Eric McCoy. At that point, we draft whoever. Because we're going to sign Ziggy Ansah next week. So we don't desperately, when they convinced themselves that Ansah was worth signing. So at that point, they knew he was coming in, whether they drafted Collier or not. So they didn't have to take Collier there, but they did it anyway because they thought, we've traded Frank, we need a replacement. That is just not good. And I'm convinced that their sort of double dip in their heads with those 2 picks was either Gary or Burns and then Jonathan Abram, the safety. And obviously they trade down when Burns and Gary aren't there. And then Jonathan Abram comes off the board. And they had back-to-back picks, and they didn't pick till the 2nd pick. And they looked like there was a panic in the war room about what they were going to do. They take LJ Collier, they trade down, they take Marquise Blair. I think in their heads, they'd said, we need a D-line and a safety, whatever happens with those first 2 picks, and that's that. I don't think you can draft like that. I think there always has to be some semblance of need, Jeff. You always have to think, we desperately need this, we need to come out with one of these. But sometimes you've just got to accept the board the way it is and not pass up great talent. If they didn't trade up for DK Metcalf at the end of round 2, that draft would have been a complete catastrophe. And we like to give them the benefit of the doubt because of DK. But that was a golden opportunity to launch that reset a year after you'd started it with 2 first-round picks, and they just made a complete dog's dinner of it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, you could argue, it's easy to say, like, oh, they got DK, they crushed the draft. But you got to look at the process of the whole thing, and you got to take a step back. And the Collier thing, there's a great picture that goes around Twitter of John and Pete's face in that press conference. They look like they saw a ghost. And it's easy to take like a still image, and they were rattled. They were rattled by what happened in that draft. And I think they had targeted Gary and Burns because Montez Sweat was on the board when they first came on the clock. And if they liked Montez Sweat, who he had a lot of red flags, but he's turned into a really, really good player. But obviously they didn't view him as in their range. And so I think they went in thinking, I know Burns was their guy if everything works out, but I never thought Burns would make it to 21. Gary was a guy that scared me a little bit as a prospect because he didn't produce in Michigan. But I think he's a guy the Seahawks would have liked. He fits just the way they view players. They like the upside. And once things went awry for them, you're right. Like, it's weird because I know a lot of front offices just being iced to cover the Bills. Like, one of the things they do is they do scenarios. They do tons of mock draft scenarios, knowing that if the worst case happens, how do we pivot? And I don't know if they did that, and this was like a super worst case scenario, but the 2 first, they were not ready. And the Collier thing, Collier was like a 3rd round prospect, maybe late 2, but like Chase Winovich was a guy they could have taken later if they pivoted, and they could have found areas where maybe you sign another player, maybe you make a trade later. But and the problem is I've seen this a bunch of their drafts. It was like the Malik McDowell thing, I know that didn't work out for other reasons, but they went to that draft like hyper-focused, like we got to get that defensive tackle to put us over the top. They mentioned Calais Campbell. They ended up trading for Sheldon Richardson. They were so set on that one position, again, when that was a roster that needed a lot of long-term work. They were old. They had a lot of guys coming off the books. And the problem with the Seahawks is that they've done this so many times. They go into the draft, and the Penny thing is a perfect example. Chris Carson got hurt. The running game fell apart. They're like, okay, we need a running back. Ignoring all the questions about either taking a running back, whether they took the right one or not. They go into drafts with the wrong approach. And we've seen it time and time again. I think it's why they've been so bad. The Jermaine Ufetti pick, I think it was the same thing. It was a weird year of offensive tackles at that point in the draft where it was like Jason Spriggs, Jermaine Ufetti. And they go into these drafts thinking, okay, we got to get this position rather than you let the draft come to you. And the teams that draft well, and they did at the beginning because they had so many needs, it was easy for them because they didn't have holes. They had basically an expansion team. So they just took good players. But now what they've done as the teams moved along is they hyper-focus on one need. And I think that sets you up for mistakes. And if they just looked at the draft, and that was like another historic receiver class where A.J. Brown, Metcalf, Terry McLaurin, Deebo Samuel, all those guys. Like, imagine they drafted Deebo and Metcalf. Like, you have 2 guys on NFL.
Think Russell Wilson wants to leave?
Yeah. NFL teams love second-round picks because you get, like, first-round caliber players for a $5 million contract over 4 years. So imagine you have those 2 guys, and then you take Chase Winovich in the 3rd round, who probably would produce the same as Collier. That's a really good draft. Or Elkin Jenkins. He's a starting left guard on a rookie deal on the best offensive line in the NFL. And I see this with John and his staff way too often. And to me, it's his blind spot. And until he makes that adjustment, it's hard to know if Jordan Brooks was that position last year for them. But they've done this time and time again, Penny, and it's why their first-round pick run has just been so poor. And Marquise Blair's another one where they're like, we need a safety. And you look at that spot, and now he's playing in nickel corner, and they've traded for Jamal Adams, and it's an odd approach to team building, and it's why they're constantly chasing rather than letting the draft come to them. And that's what someone like Baltimore is probably the best drafting team in the NFL because they go into a draft not thinking, okay, we got to have this one guy. They will take good players from good schools. Time and time again, they're just hitting doubles. That's what Daniel Jeremiah says about their mentality. They're not trying to hit home runs. And Seattle is just too hyper-focused.
Got a message here from Curtis, and he says 2019 draft, they took Blair and Barton and then immediately gave their spots to Adams and Brooks the next year. Bad double dipper positions that aren't 100% critical. And that's a good point because, they take Marquise Blair. Well, you can even include Collier in this. You draft Collier and then you immediately think, well, right, we need Ziggy Ansah and Jadeveon Clowney because he's not good enough. And then you draft Marquise Blair, you don't start him, and then you trade for Quandre Diggs, which wasn't a bad trade by any stretch at all. But you trade for Quandre Diggs, and then a year later, you're spending the house for Jamal Adams. And it's like, well, why did you draft Marquise Blair? Why take him in the mid-second round if you had no intention of giving him a chance to start, and then you go and, at great expense, trade for two different safeties? That just doesn't make any sense. And then with Barton, again, well, we'll trade up for Barton. We'll give Bobby Wagner a huge extension. But then just to be safe, we'll go and draft a first-round linebacker. I mean, the thought process for those doesn't work. I also wonder, Jeff, whether they overthink things too much because look, every year I do a combine preview thing and I just list, right, okay, over the years, this is what they generally look for in a pass rusher. This is what they look for in a corner. This is what they look for in a receiver because there's so many trends with the positions they go for. 2018 draft, okay, they want a running back. That's fine. It's in that position, they had the pick of a great running back class, apart from Saquon Barkley, and they decided they're going to go in that direction. Okay, that's their choice. They went that route. You've got a guy in Nick Chubb who is everything that they look for: size, explosive traits, attitude, speed, production in the SEC, carries a team in Georgia to the championship game, everything they want. And the draft Rashad Penny, and I'm thinking, okay, Penny's not as explosive, he's not as physical, he's not even remotely what they've drafted before at the position. And then a few years later on, you see Lance Zierlein tweeting out that the Seahawks massively regret taking Penny instead of Nick Chubb. And I'm thinking, well, if you're going to go down that road, why have you second-guessed yourself there and made that pick? And then a year later with Collier, there wasn't one quality within LJ Collier's physical profile that they generally look for in pass rushers. They've never drafted anybody like LJ Collier, let alone in the first round. And yet they take him. They force that pick and they take him. Again, you ran through some of those receivers. They only take receivers that run 4.4s or faster. AJ Brown, Deebo Samuel, DK Metcalf. There was a couple of others who ran in the 4.4s who you pivot at that point and you say, we ain't going to get a pass rusher. We'll get two great receivers. We're building around Russell Wilson. We've paid him $35 million a year. He's going to be the focal point. We'll surround talent around him. That's not us being too clever by half in hindsight. That just sounds like common sense.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And overthinking is a good word for it. They overcompensate a lot. They overreact to what happened the year before. So if you remember John Schneider's quote after Rashad Penny was drafted, he talked about his durability analytics grade. And it's something we laugh about a lot because who knows what that means. And Rashad Penny's been banged up in the pros, which is even funnier. And Nick Chubb, if you remember, had a pretty significant injury in the history of Georgia. So they're coming out that 2017 year where Chris Carson got hurt in the year, and their only healthy running back was J.D. McKissick. Thomas Rawls had been beaten up. So they, instead of focusing on what the best player was, they got caught into this, who's the healthiest running back? And the first thing John said was his durability grade with our analytics team was through the roof.
For 1 year in a weak conference for a team who's their previous running back who started ahead of him, weighed 160 pounds and set the NCAA record for rushing yards.
And exactly. So they overcompensated to their injury results, which are unpredictable. Anyone can get injured in the NFL. And they valued a guy based on his durability grade. And to me, there is a lot of overthinking and overcompensating. And if you look at a lot of their moves, it's exactly what you said. A lot of their moves have counterintuitive logic. We're like, why are you trading Frank Clark away, who's maybe the most explosive player you've had? And he had all the explosive traits that they look for in pass rushers, to draft the least explosive defensive lineman And then 2 years later, trade up for Darrell Taylor, who's got the Clark kind of physical profile. And you're just constantly going through these cycles of what are they thinking? And it is a classic. I think it's twofold. I think, one, they overcompensate to what happened the year before. I think we saw with the base defense thing with Pete Carroll. They couldn't cover the Rams. They didn't have a group they thought. So they said, okay, we're going to try to do this base defense thing. And they had Michael Kendricks on the field all year instead of Ugo Amadi.
I had truly forgotten about the base defense thing.
Yeah, it was mind-boggling. And then they realized, oh, that was stupid. Like, the whole NFL plays nickel, and Ugo Amadi had a pretty good year this year. And it just seems like it's a constant pattern of they're overcompensating to what happened the year before. And then their plan is just counterintuitive to how they've done things in the past. And the Collier pick is a great example of that. So is the Penny one is the worst illustration of that, because you're right. Nick Chubb is everything they've looked for in the profile of a running back. The Kristen Michael, the Eddie Lacy, even like they like Marshawn, Chris Carson, who Pete fell in love with, a bigger, more physical running back. And they were worried about the injury history. And because of what happened to Thomas Rawls and Chris Carson, they pivoted way too far. And it's why last year, KJ Wright was injured. KJ Wright's a 30-year-old guy in the last year of his deal. If you're focusing your first round on his current injury situation, that is mind-boggling. And that's why they picked Jordan Brooks. Jordan Brooks does look like a good player. But again, it comes back to the point of how are they building this team with an off-ball linebacker and then you're saying you might pay KJ Wright and you're paying Bobby Wagner a premium. I love Bobby Wagner, but paying him $18 million was a mistake. I will not argue that. I think you left their team and you say you took two $9 million offensive linemen instead. What is a better situation right now? You could have drafted a linebacker in multiple drafts. And I love Bobby. I think he's a great player, but I don't think you just look across their team and the decisions they made. You're right. Overcompensating, overthinking is a common theme.
Yeah, there's one. I know that this has been quite a negative podcast, so if people are, we just want to get into. I think these are kind of topics that don't really get discussed in a lot of other places. Because there's nothing wrong with this, Jeff. There is a tendency amongst the whole of the Seattle media to give them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, when the Jamal Adams trade that I'm going to talk about now, the number of times you'll hear somebody say, "Well, they did the right thing because this draft there's no combine and there's no meetings, so it's understandable why they took the sure thing versus the unknown." You hear that an awful lot. I would argue, well, more than ever, you need that cheap Damian Lewis on $800,000 salary starter than you ever needed that before. And actually having a safety who you might have to pay $18 million a year is not the road you want to be going down right now. And Jamal Adams is not going to take the Seahawks to a Super Bowl. He may well be part of a great, complete team. He would be an asset there, but he is not a Bosa brother, an Aaron Donald, that type who, I don't think anybody in the NFC West, the week leading up to the Seahawks game, is thinking, oh crap, we've got to play Jamal Adams today. Whereas as a Seahawks fan, you have that feeling, how are you going to stop Aaron Donald every single time you play the Rams? And it will be that way with Nick Bosa when he's back as well. So I will finish with a bit of fun, and I completely appreciate your time as well, Jeff, because we've been doing an hour. So we'll have a quick chat about.
I'm happy to keep going. This is fun.
We'll have a quick chat about Jamal Adams. I've got a couple of fun things to finish with. Adams pick. So I think, or trade. I've always felt that was a desperation move because they got to the right at the end of what was essentially the off-season. Camp had started or was just about to start. They'd made no impact additions to the defense. The only player that you could really call an impact player was potentially Dunbar. And he was having his legal issues in Florida at the time. And I think they saw Adams available. And I think Pete Carroll, more than maybe John Schneider, said, we've got to get that guy. He can come in. He can do this, that, and the other. We'll be flexible with him. He can help the pass rush. We'll blitz him a lot. We need a star. He's a star. Just get it done. And then I think John went and negotiated from a terrible position, which is we need this guy. And the Seahawks were bent over a barrel and ended up giving up 2 first-round picks, a third, and Bradley McDougald. I have absolutely no idea what other team was offering that. Tony Pauline, who is very connected to the New York Jets, has fantastic sources, was consistently saying on his podcast every week during this whole Jamal Adams thing, it'll take a first and another pick. He didn't say 2 firsts. He said a first and another pick. And it ended up being 2 firsts, a third, and a player for Adams and a fourth. I don't understand how it ever got to that level. And I don't think you can justify being out of this draft to the extent that they are for saying they've got Jamal Adams. And guess what? Next year, they're out of the first round as well. So they're already at a disadvantage for 2 years now, all for the sake of having Jamal Adams. I think that is going to go down as one of the worst trades that the Seahawks have done. Personally, I would get out of that trade as quickly as possible because I don't think he's worth $18 to $20 million to Seattle. He may well be to somebody else who plays a defense that is more conducive to what he did, a defense like Todd Bowles's, Greg Williams's. That's what suits him. In that sort of 3-4 where you've got anybody rushing from any position at any time is great. When you just have him line up at the line of scrimmage and I'm sat in Rotherham and can go, oh, Jamal's blitzing on this down, that's not a good thing because the quarterback can see it as well. I don't think it's worth the investment. I think the Seahawks fans are split pretty much down the line on this because you get some fans who go, I just don't get the trade. I don't get the value. You get a lot of Seahawks fans also saying, are you crazy? Trade Jamal Adams? Why would you do that? And I'm very much in the just move on camp. Where are you at with it?
Well, it's tough. It's sort of like it's like the stock market. What the Seahawks did was say, what was it? Tesla a couple of weeks ago was like $900. It was their peak. It's the highest it's ever been. And like now it's down to $600. Seahawks bought Jamal Adams at $900. And he's worth $600, $500. And it's the kind of move that's going to leave lingering damage. And you're right. I think it was a complete desperation. If you remember last year, Russell said at the Pro Bowl, like, we need superstars. And they didn't have any superstars. I think Jamal came available. And like you saw with J.J. Watt, who I've been very critical of that deal, when you get into a bidding war, you make mistakes. If people are buying houses, they see this all the time. And you get into a bidding war and they overpaid by it. When I first saw the trade, I picked up my phone. I remember looking at it and seeing they traded a first and a third. I remember thinking, you know what, that's a steep price, but like I can live with that. And then my friend texted me like 2 firsts and a third. Like, you guys are nuts. And then I almost fell over because that cost is just. And listen, I love Jamal Adams as a player. I'm sort of in the camp with some people on Seahawks Twitter who really support him. He is a blue chip player. He's one of the best safeties in the league. He's really unique. I love what he does for a program, the kind of confidence that this team sort of lost, the energy. But I can't get past that acquisition cost. Not only does it to the short term, but it does to the long term. And now you have to sign him. And the thing that I'm always left with is if you just simply shop that acquisition cost around the league, if you called every team in the league and said, we're willing to give you 2 1s and a 3, what do you think you could have got? And I think if you got offers from every single team, like say New Orleans, who knew they had this cap crunch coming up, if you offer them 2 1s and a 3 in the last August, like you could have got Marshawn Lattimore and plus. You look around this, you could have got a stud offensive lineman plus something else. There are teams looking to shed money all the time. There are teams looking to shed players. If you just traded that same package, even though I advocate strongly against this, I hate trading that kind of package away because I value the draft so much, especially when you have a highly paid quarterback. You need cheap labor to make your salary work. If they simply just did that and offered every single team 2 1s and a 3, the packages they could have got are so much better. And again, I like Jamal as a player. I just think it was a desperation mistake because, yeah, they looked at it like you're sitting 29th in the draft to get a top 10 talent. You're going to have to trade that package anyway. That's how they're rationalizing it. But I don't think that's a smart way to build a team, especially when you said that you mentioned this before. Did they not project forward? Did they not model what's going to happen after 2020? Because now you're left with Jamal, who needs a new contract. You have all these needs coming up. That's not like they were hard to predict. You knew the defensive end was lingering. You knew they had a third receiver issue. You knew they had offensive line potential issues, cornerback issues. Shaq Griffin was coming up. That was obviously the big lingering question. And some people will say, well, they draft poorly. That's not justification to do something. That's just
gets mentioned a lot, though, doesn't it? People justify that I always love that.
Drafted Collier and Affetti.
But then I always say it's not that you need less picks in that situation. You just need to draft better.
Or you need more picks, if anything. You should make, like, at the first, like, you look at the Jalen Ramsey trade. I was very critical of that trade, and something I was probably wrong about in the end, because Jalen Ramsey is a dominant coverage player, which in this era of the NFL is probably the most dominant. It's one of the most valuable things you can have. You saw the Rams with not a great roster, and what Ramsey did for that team. But Jamal Adams is a very unique player where he's more of an edge rusher, more of a tackler, and he's okay in coverage. I don't think he's as bad as people think he is, but to give up that capital for a player who really – they actually regressed as a team this year. If you look at their purely at their playoff results, they didn't win a playoff game, and they got killed in that playoff game. And Jamal was banged up, and now considering Jamal's injuries, if you put him on the market, who's a guy you need to pay, he's a guy who had multiple surgeries, a guy who probably had his worst year from a coverage standpoint. And you look at how Pete and Ken Norton run their defense. You talked about this before. They're not this creative disguise. You can see exactly on screen why I was so critical of Norton last year. You can almost project exactly when he's going to blitz. And sure, he got a lot of sacks, but a lot of the time you left the coverage vulnerable. And that's part of blitzing. So I really like Jamal as a player. And in the second half of the year, I think he did make, like, that last Rams game of the regular season, I thought Jamal was a fantastic player in that game. But again, you look at what they're left with now, next year, and you have to sign all these players, and you don't have those cheap picks coming in. To me, it just left them too vulnerable. And I'm just left back to the thing, like, did they not model for 1 year out? Because I know Evan from our show goes crazy that they haven't signed him yet. And the safety market's going to keep getting more expensive, which means everyone thinks he's going to ask for $20 million. So now you're left with a guy, not only do you give up 3 high priority picks for, now you're going to have to give him 18 to 20 million. To me, that's like what a 10-year-old does when they bought a Madden game for the first time and they're building a franchise mode and just trade for their favorite player. That's not what an NFL team can do, because the draft picks and the contract, it just leaves the team in a terrible position. And again, this is coming from a guy, I really like Jamal. I really like the player he is. But from a team building process, to me, it's just, you saw me facepalm earlier. It's a facepalm every time. I cringe every time I think about this year's draft.
20 million is 2 Gabe Jacksons. It's 2 players of that quality. And then you've got 2 firsts. So you've then got 2 first round talented players. And then you let's say you trade down, you may be able to add a 3rd round if you trade down one of those years as well. So then you're talking about 3 cost-effective players who could actually be quite good for you. A reminder, they took Damian Lewis in round 3 last year. And you're talking about 2 veteran players of the quality and experience of someone like Gabe Jackson. So what's better for the Seahawks? 1 Jamal Adams, or potentially 5 or 6 players filling out your roster? I mean, that's a way of looking at it. I was like you. Do you know when the trade actually came down? Because I was sat right here, right next to where I'm sat now. And I saw the trade, and it was an exciting, because you always get excited when you see that your team is traded for a big name. So the initial reaction was, oh, that's interesting. And then I saw the compensation, and so my wife was sat on the couch across, and she was presented with a 30-minute epic rant of what are they doing? Like, there's only really, I think Myles Garrett, I could have got on board with 2 firsts and a 3rd. Aaron Donald, I wouldn't have. I don't think I'd have celebrated Joey Bosa for that, because he's had injuries.
And you would have had to pay him $27 million, right?
So there was only really like a couple of all-star legendary pass rushers. And of course, if they didn't have a quarterback and they'd have traded for someone like Deshaun Watson for that, or even another, 3 firsts or 4 firsts, then I would have been content with that as well, because you need a quarterback. But for a safety, and as much as I like Jamal Adams, everyone likes Jamal Adams. Everyone watched Jamal for the Jets and thought, what a player. But I just couldn't believe it, Jeff. And listen, I honestly do not want to be negative about the Seahawks. I think this is one of the things, like, after the whole year, I've never had more sort of pushback on the blog and on Twitter than I have in the last 12 months, because I just don't see I don't agree with the way they've handled their pass rush. I don't agree with how they've built their roster. I don't agree with the Jamal Adams trade. I think they're in a real quandary now with all of this situation. I don't want to ignore the Russell Wilson thing, even if he doesn't get traded. I think the sheer fact that he is even thinking about that he has to go somewhere else to win should be a concern. And when you sort of piece all these things together, I think it's right to sort of embrace them and talk about them and not pretend that everything's great just because they whipped the arse of the NFC East and the AFC East last year, won a bunch of close games that they had no business being close when Russell Wilson was throwing 100 touchdowns in the first six games of the season, and those were all like one-score games, and then getting their asses kicked by the Rams in the playoffs. I've been here with other teams, not in the NFL, but with other teams where you kind of see some semblance of success, but behind the scenes, Jeff, you know that eventually it will catch up, and you're always talking about it too late. You're always seeing people always sort of reflect and go, that wasn't good. But it's always too late when you have those conversations. I think it is a conversation worth having now.
Well, you want to look at revisionist history with the Seahawks. Percy Harvin, and I know they won the Super Bowl that year, but Percy Harvin trade was 1 and a 3, I believe. And they had to get out of it 1 year later. And that trade itself, looking at the Jamal Adams, where you said it not only cost them the first and the third, but they could have got good players. Like I know DeAndre Hopkins and like Xavier Rhodes went right after those picks. But that trade cost you Golden Tate. And you couldn't sign Golden Tate, or you couldn't sign a Chris Clemens. And the next year in the Super Bowl, I don't want to bring this up, but Ricardo Lockett's on the field because you don't have Golden Tate. Right? And trades like that have lingering damage on a roster in terms of building. And yeah, obviously if they had Percy, he's on the field there, but a trade like Jamal could cost you 4 to 5 players when you consider the picks and the money. So you're right. Like it's the sort of thing that people see Jamal Adams, the flashy name. It's exciting. Fans get pumped. But those kind of trades have just lingering damage that lasts for a long time. And the Percy one was a perfect one. Say you took DeAndre Hopkins and the money that you could have spent on Percy. He was making like $13 million at the time. You could have put in you could have kept maybe Max Unger for longer, or you could have done you could have signed an offensive lineman. And that's what's going to happen here. As much as everyone wants to deny it and think we're going to be okay, this is the kind of trade that's going to leave lingering holes. And you're going to see it in this draft when players you like are going to go where they're supposed to be picking. And Jamal is going to be better probably next year than all these guys, but there's always an opportunity cost in having that $1 million player versus a $20 million player. They're really in tough now. They're really going to find cheaper value picks and cheaper value players, because if they don't find them, the roster is going to be uneven. And that's sort of what happened last year. As much as they had a better roster last year, oddly enough, than they did in 2018 and 2019, where those teams were not very good. Russell just played out of his mind and kind of carried them. Last year, they started to look like a team that could compete, but in the end, you just saw their limitations on the offensive line, and you saw their limitations on defense. And as things go along, the cap will go up, but they're going to have roster limitations from this trade. No doubt in my mind.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think he makes some great points there, and Mike's said as much in the comments there. Very, very interesting. And you're right. You know what? I was looking at it because, again, in sort of anticipation, trying to be as prepared as possible for what the news that we never thought we would hear, which was Russell Wilson had been traded last week. I was looking at what the best options were at 20, and the Seahawks would have picked at 23 if they'd not traded Jamal Adams, and that is probably a sweet spot for pass rushers this year. And Carlos done that plus a first round rookie. Yeah, you could probably go a long way with that, and then still just play Marquise Blair or Bradley McDougall or whoever at safety, or get Keanu Neal, who's just gone to the Cowboys for $5 million. So anyway, we've
signed for $10 million.
Say that again.
John Johnson signed for $10 million, right?
Yeah. Much cheaper.
It's hard not to think back and be like, well, Jamal's going to cost potentially double that and the draft picks. You could have signed Keanu Neal or John Johnson, and you're in a way better.
Yeah.
But again, I don't want to spend too much time, because the Seahawks, for the most part, have had a good start to their offseason. I haven't said that very often. Every year I find myself pissed off by what's going on.
I just hope that in a couple of weeks, Jeff, we'll be on Twitter saying, yeah, fair enough. Some of those concerns that we raised have been answered. But until you get there, it's worth having a conversation about it. And I'm sure that you're the same. If they get stuff done, I'll be the first one to say, well done, the Seahawks. And it's just that we're talking about what we know to be true today, and hopefully in the coming days, some of those issues will be sorted. I said I wanted to finish with a bit of fun. You're in Canada, am I right? You're in the east side in Toronto. I used to live in Vancouver, which is the west side. Many, many years. It was 15 years ago next month that I moved to Vancouver with my girlfriend at the time. Now she's long-suffering wife. What is the best thing about Canada, in your opinion?
After seeing all the political stuff that happened with Trump in the last year, and
going straight to the politics.
Yeah, just seeing a different side of America. Like, my family has a place in Florida, and my favorite sport is football. I'm more of like an American from like a sports, a pop culture, and I've always like wanted to move to the States. But for me, seeing what happened in the last year with, I don't want to offend anyone on the show, but just seeing the crazed side of America, I've never felt more Canadian in my life. And everyone jokes with me in Canada that like I'm way too American. Like, everyone's crazy about hockey here. I love the NFL. And obviously free healthcare would be the safe answer, but that, to me, it was just seeing how that unfolded in the last year and just seeing how different we were. And I always feel so similar to everyone I talk to on Twitter. That was it.
Can I give you my answer?
Yeah.
It's slightly different. Tim Hortons French vanilla coffee.
Oh, man.
I went last time I went to Vancouver. What I generally tend to do is I will either go straight to Seattle. The last 2 times I've been straight to Seattle for Seahawks games, or I will go to Vancouver and then take the bus from Vancouver to Seattle and just go on the day and then come back. Because let's be fair, there's not that much to do in Seattle when you've been like several times already. So you just going there for like the week again is to mix it up a little bit, see some friends in Vancouver. And there was the last time I was in Vancouver, I drank 3 of these things in like 3 in a day. And then when I got on the plane to go back home, I was like, geez, my jeans, they don't fit anymore, And I didn't realize how much sugar was in those things.
Double chin.
I was like, well, how much sugar is in these things? Then I looked at them when I got home and I was like, okay, next time I go, I cannot have 3 of those, large one of those in a day. The other things that I really love about Vancouver, and when I lived there, Red Robin fries, they put the spice stuff on them. There's quite a theme to this. And they do a strawberry lime drink as well, which is amazing. And there isn't a day goes by that I regret the fact that those things do not exist in Rotherham. However, there is a Tim Hortons in Birmingham, which is about 2 hours away from me. And it is absolutely terrible. It is nothing like the Tim Hortons in Canada. You can tell that it's a bit like, I'm trying to think, in Britain, we're very good at cups of tea and roast dinners and Yorkshire puddings. If someone in Canada tried to do those things, they probably wouldn't be as good. British people doing Tim Hortons is not as good. It should stay in Canada.
Yeah, Tim Hortons is a good one. Have you ever had the iced cappuccino?
Oh, yes. I used to, every day when I was walking into work, I would be in Tim Hortons, and there isn't a thing I don't like about Tim Hortons. So
I live very close to one. It's been dangerous during our winter.
But I love Canada. It's a great place to live. And one of the other things I loved about it is the Seahawks games didn't start at 1 o'clock in the morning when they were on prime time. So that was the other thing.
See, that's the thing I'm jealous with about people who live in Seattle. Because our games start, obviously a little different for you. Our games start 1 p.m. Eastern time. And for me, like, waiting till 1 o'clock is so painfully slow. Like, when it's nice that I can go for a walk, when it's like October or November and it's freezing cold, I'm just sitting there like, I imagine 1 a.m. is much harder. But like, people get to wake up and have their games. The games start at 10 a.m. I'm so jealous of that. To me, like, every Sunday, I'm just sitting there staring at a clock. I'm like, I can't watch NFL pregame shows anymore. I don't know if you're the same way with this anymore.
Yeah, I don't watch I can't watch a
can't watch it. I can't. The talk is too dumb and too watered down. And now with like Twitter and podcasts.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, it was great because you learned about the league there. And now it's just like, they're talking like it's Joe Flacco elite or something, and like I can't listen to this for 3 hours.
Yeah, do you know, that's a really interesting point. Actually, it's something I've not really thought about before. But I never watched them, and it's because I'd probably rather listen to somebody who would really get into the detail of something.
Yeah,
you know, and really get into sort of this is why this, and this is we're going to be quite technical about it, so that I could come out afterwards and learn something. But for the sort of I guess for the fan who doesn't want that level of detail, who's not quite as obsessive about the NFL as I am, they just want to see Kurt Warner, or they want to see some guy they recognize, and they just say this guy is great and I think the Bills will win or something, so I never watch any of that, and yeah, I think with the games over here, it's good because like it's evening. If there's it's a 6 p.m. game for like the early game for the 10 a.m. games in Seattle, and then it's like 9 o'clock but when it's like 1 o'clock in the morning, I don't miss any games, so I'm gonna have to stay up till 4 in the morning, and sometimes. So and the story I always tell, and I'm sorry if you've heard this before, anybody who's listening to this, the Super Bowl when they lost, I then just went straight to work, and so they lost. I had to go and do a sports bulletin on a radio breakfast show. And we don't have sports talk radio over here. So it was radio, and I'm doing the sports bulletin as part of the news. And then at the end I had to go, and the New England Patriots won the Super Bowl last night, beating the Seattle Seahawks. And I was like, oh God, it killed me having to read that. And then I was like coming into the office and people go, oh, did you have a good weekend? I'm like, yeah. And because I know that they don't want to listen to me complain about the Super Bowl. And then like 2 days later, I sort of like was home and my wife was there, and I just said, okay, I'm very sorry about this, but you're going to sit here and watch the end of this game with me, and I'm just going to cry. So, and that was how it went. So, life as a Seahawks fan. Jeff, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. It's been fantastic to get you on. You've got some great opinions. Love the podcast with you guys. When are you next on, so we can tune in and catch Real Hawk Talk?
I believe we have a show coming up on Wednesday. We're usually Wednesday, 8 o'clock Pacific time. During the off season, our schedule gets a little wonky. We try to go every week, but if there's points like this in the calendar, we would have spent a lot of time doing a draft preview show. But thanks to Jamal Adams and John Schneider, our enthusiasm for the draft is a little low right now.
Yeah, the good thing is if you do a 7-round mock draft, it takes 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's just a lot of times we could spend days talking about what they're going to do with their first or third round pick or who they're going to trade back for. And so we'll be on if the Seahawks do something with Carlos Dunlap or someone, or we've been doing more emergency shows, but we're now at the point of the offseason where it's like the free agency period is going to be painfully slow, and the draft is, unless they make a big trade coming up. So we'll be on here and again, and then during the season, we're every week.
Final question then. What are the chances out of 10 that if you do a show on Wednesday, there's something interesting to talk about that is new? What do you think?
2.
Oh, God. I
just think the Seahawks they're going to be at the point where they're going to try to overplay their hand and just wait for that value to get to the sweet spot. And just historically, based on how I saw the defensive end thing get handled last year, I'm only anticipating that again, where something has to happen to move them, because I think they're just, until they restructure a contract, I don't think they're going to make a move until you see that. Maybe they'll sign KJ Wright or something, but I don't think that's the kind of move that will get me fired up. I think they have to do something with Dunlap or Sherman or something to get us like pumped up and ready to go.
Bring Sherm home. I have to say it, otherwise people shout at me. So we forgot to mention that. Jeff, it's been great having you. I really hope that there is something interesting to talk about. I kind of published my article demanding something on the Carlos Dunlap stuff yesterday in hope that I would tempt fate and that I would look really stupid because they would sign him 10 minutes later, but it didn't work. And I kind of thought that, well, maybe they just had the weekend off and then nothing's happened today either. So fingers crossed something happens. It's been great to have Jeff. Check him out on Real Hawk Talk. You will probably be watching. If you're watching this, you'll be watching that anyway, because you like me, you just can't get enough Seahawks talk. So check out the podcast if you haven't already. YouTube channel, make sure you subscribe. Hit the little bell thing if you want to know when the next stream is coming up. That helps. Share the video around if you can go on like Reddit and forums and stuff and share it. Or if you've got a Twitter account and you can retweet it, the link out for it. Try and spread the message a little bit. For more analysis, SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Great community on there, chatting away every day. If you want to get into some Seahawks chat and carry it on in there. Until next time, we'll have another stream soon. Take care. We'll speak soon.